Hello, and thank you for joining me in the 5th episode of Whisky on the Water. It's an occasional series in which I combine my loves of whisky and my love of travel, with a special focus on whiskies available on cruise ships. It is always special when you have some form of a connection with a distillery and with a whisky, such as when you visit the distillery itself. The Highland Park distillery is a standout special for me and very relevant to this series. The reason being that I actually have visited this distillery, but I did so whilst I was on our first cruise after the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. Highland Park is a wonderful distillery to visit. The tours are informative, the tastings are appreciated, and the distillery itself is beautiful. It's also a distillery where much is still done on the premises, which means you get to see more of the process, from malting all the way through to the warehouse. The problem with the distillery is its location. Set on the outskirts of Kirkwall on the largest of the Orkney Islands, known as the mainland, it's not possible to simply drive there. In fact, it's closer to Bergen in Norway than it is to Glasgow in Scotland, and is actually 123 miles more than double the distance to London. To give context, it is further north than Moscow and is roughly on the same latitude as southern Greenland. It is so far north that historically, despite being previously occupied by Picts, it was taken by the Norsemen and retained associations with that culture. Even recently, there have been discussions, and it came to votes, exploring the idea that it break away from Britain and the UK and join Norway. Fortunately, it has a small port that can be visited by cruise ships, which is what we did. At the time, the ship did not offer excursions to the distillery, which was something I was very pleased about. Ships' excursions can be a touch expensive and frequently result in large amounts of people all at once. They do, however, bring security regarding getting back onto the ship on time. Kirkwall is, however, only a small place. The distillery is only a 3-mile taxi ride from Hatson Pier, where cruise ships can dock, and only just over a mile from the harbour, where you tender to if you're not docked at the Hatson Pier. Tours can be arranged in advance online, and there is also a distillery shop in the town centre as well. The roads, they're not really subject to traffic jams, and these distances can even make it possible to do on foot. With a little sensible planning, there is no real need to worry. You can also take advantage of the chance to buy some limited releases, as we did, such as the distillery-only bottlings. Getting back on the ship with bottles of whisky is not really a problem. We have done so many times, and often have been allowed to take those bottles back to the cabin. And on the occasions when they didn't allow that to happen, they were kept safely and returned to us on the last day of the cruise. When I say that I love whisky, I don't mean just the drink. I love many aspects of it, including the culture, the history, even the marketing. Highland Park is a great example why. It is far away from other Scottish distilleries, with the exception of one other on the island, Scapa, another fine whisky, but one I have yet to find on a cruise ship. The often used imagery of Scotch whisky is not dominant on Highland Park's bottles. Past artwork has been more Viking than Gallic, and toasts are often made in the word skull rather than sláinte. The flavour is also affected. There is an Irish peated whisky called Connemara. It is a lovely whisky, and the flavour has a softer and earthier sense to it than the coastal salty peats of Islay. A similar thing applies to Highland bark. The Orkney Islands don't have many trees. It's just too windy for them, so the landscape is more of heathery slopes. This heather gives a character to the peat that is carried through to the whisky, giving it a special level of atmosphere. Orkney peat differs from Islay peat. It has more of a carbohydrate derivatives as opposed to Islay's peat, which holds more lignin derivatives. I am not saying one is better than the other, just that they are different. It is a bit like the difference between walking into a room of cigar smoke or a room full of pipe smoke. Both are smoke, both them tobacco, and yet there is a difference between them. The same goes for peat. The result is a unique flavoured whisky in a distinctive bottle with striking artwork. The distillery first got a licence in 1798. That's 227 years ago at time of recording, and 87 years before its neighbouring Scapa distillery. But there was activity before that. It is old hat to make jokes based on the word spirit having more than one meaning, but Highland Park can truly claim some origin in the Holy Spirit. The founder was Magnus Jonsson, known as Mansi. He was a butcher during the daytime as well as being a church beadle, meaning that he had a position in the church in which he had certain duties. He was charged with keeping order, giving notices, and a range of other duties on top of that. In the past, there are parts of the land of Scotland that held an advantage of being somewhat protected from the official inspectors. The Campbelltown area is a good example, whereby the taxman would often have to arrive by boat, which meant that those who needed it had a degree of warning. Orkney would have been another example due to its remoteness. However, this is not to say that it was lawless and care was still needed. Mansi was a known whisky smuggler as well as a butcher and a beadle, and an illicit distiller as well, who is believed to have distilled on the site of the current distillery. The story is told of how he would hide his stock in the church, using the pulpit itself as a storage place. On one occasion, when hearing that an official visit was about to happen, he covered his products with a sheet and placed a coffin on top. Now, just to be sure that the curiosity of the inspector didn't get the better of him, Mansi whispered one word into the inspector's ear: smallpox. That was enough to keep the inspector at bay. Mansi wasn't the only distiller on the island, but he was the one who turned legal and obtained a licence. The stories don't end there. There is a tale of how he was caught smuggling his whisky to avoid the tax. His whisky was confiscated and taken away, but the officers had to have a break. They had to break up their journey and stayed at an inn in Thurso. Mansi had followed them, and as they slept, he carefully drilled holes in the floor from below and continued to drill up through into the casks, enabling him to drain them dry and to get his whisky back. The story has a bit of a sad ending, as he was eventually charged and given the choice of either prison or leaving. Mansi left, and the distillery was vacant, only to be taken possession of by the arresting customs officer, John Robertson. It has even been said that Mansi was eventually canonised and that St Magnus's Cathedral is actually named after him. Now that would be a lovely and a great story, except for the fact that St Magnus's Cathedral dates back to 1137, when it was built to house the relics of St Magnus Barelegs, as he was known. It is a distillery full of tales, even if some of them may not be backed up with proof. One example is that during the Second World War, when, like many, the distillery went silent and stopped production, the troops, some claim up to 60,000 of them, used the distillery's washbacks as a communal bath. I don't know if that is reality, but this is part of the wonder of Orkney, the way that ancient history and recent history lay side by side, and how legend and recollection twist together in such a rich tapestry. The distillery has changed ownership over the years, as is at all not uncommon, but it has retained its unique character. In part, this is due to a number of things. I already mentioned the specific peat used to kiln the malt. Another factor is the fact that it's hand-turned floor maltings that go into part of the malt that's used. Now, one could argue that floor malting doesn't really make much of a difference. After all, malt is malt. But there are elements at play here. Malting by hand requires different levels of observation and control, plus the process requires different demands of the grain. The mechanized turning of grain is a constant process of rotation, whereas the shovel turning is sudden and impactful. In order to survive the hand-turned process, the grain needs to be stronger, and that requires having a thicker husk. And remember, it is the husk that takes up a high level of the compounds coming from the peat smoke, which then gets taken through to the distilled spirit. Then there is the warehousing on the island and the careful use of sherry casks in the maturation process. It is said that the temperature variation on the island is much less than one would actually expect. The winds may blow, but the highs and lows of snow and sun are not as much of a feature as one might think. Now, this can mean that there is less lost to the angel's share, and maturation may be gentler. In countries where the variation is great, the alcohol tends to escape and the contents drop in the ABV over time. In hotter countries, it is the water that is mainly lost, causing the contents of the cask to rise in their ABV over time. Hotter countries can mature a whisky quicker, but I often feel that it has a rougher effect as it does so. Colder countries are slower, but bring more complexity with it. Now, it may be that Highland Park is in that sweet spot of those extremes. All this aside, it also comes down to the people, the skill and craft, and the development of traditions that make it unique. There is something to be said about the value of people and time. I remember talking to Jim McEwen of Brooklady fame years ago. He was a man who could tell a tale. On one occasion, he became almost teary-eyed as he spoke about the passing of his mentor. He talked to me about time and passing things on. He talked about going into a warehouse and looking at the casks. Casks that were still there. Casks that had been filled when he was young. Casks filled by others who are no longer with us. The casks, he said, had held memories. I had this sense at Highland Park as well. There are staff there who have been there for decades. People who have been involved from malting the grain through to aging in the wood. It makes a difference. People care more when they are that involved. they put themselves into it. This is important because whisky is not just a drink, and it's not just a flavour. There is a character, culture, history and love in whisky. There is also knowledge, wisdom and hard work in the bottle. And when you drink it, in the knowledge of all these things, you connect to it in a deeper way. I drink far less than I used to, yet my love for it remains. It's hard to explain the joy from just looking at a bottle or smelling its scent. But sharing that joy is why I do this. Maybe it was this sense of joy that led to the following event. Tory Chancellor and jazz lover Kenneth Clarke made history in his 1995 UK budget by being the first ever to cut the tax on whisky. And as he did so live, he did so whilst holding a glass of Highland Park. Highland Park isn't always easily available on board, but it regularly is. It is one worth asking for, and by doing so, encourages the ships to keep them available. It is a whisky that goes well with watching waves and taking time, and is definitely one to raise a glass with as you consider its marvellous history and its glorious tales.